Hello, everyone. Thanks for joining us today for another exciting episode of the Product Management Learning Series. My name is Shavi. I'm a product manager at LinkedIn and host of today's show. So as many of you are aware, Product Management Learning Series is a series of live streaming events where we interview industry thought leaders and product builders to share their product journey, as well as lessons learned along the way and best practice to inspire aspiring and current product builders to level up their product career. Make sure you subscribe to our newsletter, which we recap key takeaways from today's events, as well as sign up for future event updates. Links of the newsletter is in the event details, so make sure you check it out there. So today it's really exciting. We're having a very, very special guest, Bob. Thank you so much for joining us. Bob Baxley is a design executive, advisor, mentor, and advocate who has built, managed, coached, and led many UX teams at some of Silicon Valley's most respected companies, including Apple, Pinterest, Yahoo, and elsewhere. So really excited to have you here, Bob. You have a career spanning over 3 decades, so very experienced. You play a very vital role in the designs of many products that we all love and use, including the Apple Online Store, Yahoo Answers, the Apple Store app, Bible Pins, and Clearest Work, products that's used by millions and millions of people around the world, right? So today we have a lot of folks joining us from all over the world. Make sure folks say hi, drop in the chat where you're joining us from. We're seeing some international crowds already. Folks joining from India, from Austin, Armenia, Pakistan, Malaysia. It's getting late Friday night, Nigeria, New York. So continue to drop in the chat where you're joining us from. We're looking forward to talking to many of you. And go, Bob, Amit said. If you have any question for Bob, also drop them in the chat. We'll pick them out from time to time. Well, Bob currently serves as the Senior Vice President of Design at ThoughtSpot, a business intelligence and data analytics platform committed to recruiting and inspiring the next generation of designers. Bob also mentors many individuals and advises organizations. They're working to improve the profession and practice of digital product design. Well, without further ado, let's welcome Bob.
Hey, thanks, Shavi. Thanks so much for having me on. Before we get rolling, I just have to say how inspired I am at all the international stuff. Living in Silicon Valley, you sort of fall victim to the idea that it's just sort of a local business. And it's always amazing when I travel to see how much tech there is all around the world, obviously, and how many cool products there are being created around the world. I was just in India. I saw somebody go by from Chennai. I was just in India. The scene there is obviously amazing. I was in Bangalore. It's just totally on fire. So awesome to see so many people from so many corners of the world working on all sorts of different and cool problems.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel very honored also every Friday when I host the show and seeing people from all over the world from places where I don't even know how to pronounce the name. So it's really awesome to see all the passion of product building coming together on LinkedIn. Now, without further ado, let's travel down the memory lane, Bob. Tell us a little bit about your career journey and what inspired you to pursue a career in product design.
Well, I'm a little bit older than your average bear. So I was born in 1963. I saw my first computer around 1976 or so. I got a Mac my last year in college, which had been about 1985. And when I first saw a computer when I was 11, I was at a friend's house and his dad was an engineer at Texas Instruments and they were like super nerds. And they had assembled a Heathkit computer. And I remember the scene vividly because I remember being in Glenn's bedroom and there was a little black and white screen and he pressed something on the keyboard and something changed on the screen. And my heart just went pitter patter and I instantly fell in love because in my world, there was nothing we could do to change what was on the screen. And so from that moment, I just go back to that over and over that I just kind of fell in love with the magic of computing. And it was sort of a circuitous route to get here. I actually studied history and film in college, which ended up to be really useful, but it wasn't like I had a plan in 1981 to be a UI designer. Such a thing didn't exist. When I graduated college, I ended up starting a desktop publishing company because that was a novel thing to do in 1985. I did that for a few years, and then I decided I wanted to get a real job, hopefully in tech. I literally sat down with one particular issue of Macworld magazine and entered the names of all the advertisers, did a mail merge, sent out 107 resumes, like little Christmas cards in the mail, Two of them came back, and one of them turned into a job with a company called Claris, which at the time was a software subsidiary of Apple, and it still is some 3.5 decades later. And then sort of again over a series of events that turned into a UI design job here in California. They moved me from Dallas, where I grew up, out to Santa Clara, where Claris still is. And I had the privilege to be the first designer on ClarisWorks. And it turns out that my brain just is particularly well suited for designing software. I have a very systems-oriented brain. I have high attention to detail. I'm really good at building models of how things should work. So I think, frankly, I think I was just sort of lucky that I stumbled into a profession that was particularly well suited to my neurological style. And I've just stuck with it because I've never been able to figure out anything that's more fun. And I've just, frankly, been really fortunate to ride the wave.
That's awesome. Three things stand out. We'll talk more about your story for sure. Three things stand out from what you just said. And also the first time when we met back in November, you struck me as someone who's like a great storyteller. I think for obvious couple of reasons. First, you sort of witnessed the evolution of both the computing age and the Silicon Valley, the bubble and like the rise. And so love to hear, part of that from some of your story. And then you were a historical and arts major. I think that helps to like tease out the best part of storytelling. And then, yes, the third thing we want to double click on today is definitely sort of getting a little bit of down low and unpacking of your brain, the pattern recognition, that detail, that system thinking from you, so that we can codify, how product builder think about design, right? But let's start from the first thing. So during the intro, I mentioned that you have worked at some of the most reputable design-centric companies, and mostly during their hyper-growth time as well, right? Like, Yahoo, Apple Retail, and Pinterest. It's storytelling time. So we would love to hear maybe some of the best lessons that you learned from your time there. And obviously, a story is not complete unless you tell us maybe a couple hard lessons, like mistakes or failures that you had, that you learned an important lesson from it over the 3 decades working for those companies.
Yeah, so I'll compare and contrast Yahoo and Apple because that's a probably good place to start. And it's something that I think is very practical and learnable for people in the product management side. Which Yahoo, I was there, it must have been about 2005, 6, something like that. So it was when Terry Semel was still CEO, and then he had just handed it off to, I believe it was Dan Rosenswag was the next CEO. I worked in the search and marketplace part of Yahoo. And I was director of design for all the search properties. So web search, video search, audio search, when Yahoo was still under the illusion that they were competitive with Google. And then probably the most important thing we got to do there was create Yahoo Answers, which was a ton of fun and sort of one of the first social media products, actually the first product in internet, or the fastest product in internet history at that point to get to 100 million users. But what Yahoo really lacked was a decision-making process. Like, you didn't really know how to get things approved and how things would be greenlit to be shipped. So Yahoo, unfortunately, was a whole big collection of incredibly smart, incredibly ambitious, driven people with no decision-making hierarchy. And as a result, it often felt like we were sitting around gouging each other's eyes out. We used to joke that Yahoo felt like a loose federation of warring tribes. And then, then I went to then I went to Apple. Because honestly, well, for one, Steve Jobs had somehow been a character in the background of my mind since I was a teenager. And I don't quite know where that attachment came from, but it was there. And I joined Apple about 9 months before the iPhone was announced. So again, incredibly lucky timing that I knew nothing about. But a big reason for me going to Apple, because Apple was, the big hot product at the time was the iPod Nano. It's not Apple the way you think of it now. It was Apple. We're not sure if it's going to survive. But I had studied a little bit of the history of Disney. And when you listen to the people that worked with Walt, they just had such great stories about what it was like to work with Walt Disney. And I think I just stumbled across something that was a list of the 100 most influential Americans in history. And Steve Jobs was one of them. And it just struck me like, when in the world am I ever going to get a chance to work with one of the 100 most influential Americans in history? And I don't know if I'm going to get to work with Steve, but just to be in the environment was worth it. And that was really kind of what cemented me wanting to go to Apple to work on the online store at the time. And then at Apple, there is a very clear decision-making process. Like, who is making the decision, and each layer owns the creative output of their team. So in my case, Jennifer Bailey, who today leads Apple Pay, she was the vice president in charge of the Apple online store. And we had a 2-hour creative review with her every Friday afternoon from 4 to 6 p.m. I had 6 designers in my studio, and we had to produce enough work every week to fill a 2-hour show. And Jennifer was in every last little detail, and she was making the decisions, and it was very clear. And that's it. I came to think of it as what I call the path to yes. And in every company, and I struggled with this a lot at Pinterest, and it's taken me a while to cement it at ThoughtSpot. But it's one of the most important things to establish for an organization, for a creative organization. What is the path to yes? Who's empowered to say this thing can go and this thing can't? As soon as you get that sort of decision-making clarity, then the creative team can move much, much faster. Without that, they'll spin their wheels, they'll fight each other. You just end up getting these creative impasses, often between a creative leader and a product leader. And escalating to the next level is not a failure. It's how hierarchical organizations work. So I sort of have this joke that, the path to yes, excuse me, it should look like mountain climbing. You should be able to see the summit up there. Now, it may be kind of death defying. You may have to go to Camp Tim and Camp Steve, and it may be pretty frightening to go up that mountain, but it should look like a mountain as opposed to spelunking, right? So I have a slide where I compare, caving to mountain climbing. And when you look at pictures of people in caves, the thing is, when the only time they're lit is when they actually take the picture. The reality of being in a cave is that it's dark and you're just wandering around figuring out what to do. And
Right.
frankly, that's what it was kind of like at Yahoo. It was like, I don't know how big this cave is. I don't know what's going on. I don't know who's going to say yes. And it's super, super frustrating and disengaging for creative staff.
Yeah, I definitely hear you on the path to yes, like the decision making, one thing I do want to double click on that, because I think there's a balance also between like creative impasse and then how do you delegate enough decision making that teams feel empowered to create creative design, but then in times when you need that clarity, the D can actually say yes or no to a certain design. How do you find that balance? And then second, do you find design and product are usually the part of the trio, right? And engineering. So what happened when there's like design wants to go a certain direction, it's not necessarily aligned with product? Who should be honing that decision-making power, in your opinion?
Yeah, so I have sort of a different opinion on this, which is that design is not some random subjective opinion-making process. It's a very clear, rational, analytical problem-solving process. So if I'm advocating for solution A and you think it should be solution B, the real trouble is not that we disagree on the solutions. The trouble is that we're not aligned on the problem. Because if we had true clarity on what we're trying to communicate to the user, what we're hoping they're going to do, how we want to position the product, whatever the issue might be, if we're super clear on that, we will both recognize that a certain solution solves it. So people often say, they feel like you're going to get into some sort of tug of war with design. And again, I just always say, no, that's not what's going on. If you're fighting over the solution, it's because you're not aligned on the problem. So you need to back up and think harder about that. And then, one thing that I see at ThoughtSpot, I think, is that a lot of times when we propose a design, I think that the PMs think that's what we're actually advocating for. And at least the way I work, most of the time I'm throwing out comps as a way to visualize ideas and to try to move the conversation forward. And so it's more sort of, I try to use a lot of language. Well, we went this approach because our instinct was this, or we felt like this might be this thing, we're playing with this idea. So, for all the PMs out there, when you look at when you look at comps, you kind of have to say, okay, how serious are they about this? What's the design intent that sits underneath it? What are they really trying to communicate, and try to tease apart that stuff? I sort of joked that creative reviews, the best ones are more like psychotherapy. And somebody, a great story I tell here is when I was working at a company called My CFO, one of the PMs came up to me one day and said, oh, we have to change this thing on the homepage and we have to make it blue. And I was like, well, we don't have to make it blue because it'll blow up the whole page. And she's like, no, we have to make it blue. And then she went behind my back and she made it blue. And I confronted her in the hallway. I'm like, why the heck did you do that? And she's like, well, people couldn't see it. And I'm like, oh, so it wasn't visually prominent enough. And she's like, yeah, it wasn't prominent enough. I'm like, great. There's like 15 different ways we could have made it more prominent because we're professional designers. You took the most obvious one because it was all you could think about because you're not trained to do this stuff. If you had brought us the problem, this thing isn't prominent enough, we probably could have found a much more elegant solution. And in my professional life, I try to draw a clear distinction between PM and design. And I actually, there's always push and pull, but I do try to say, oh, the PMs get to determine the requirements and get to kind of set up the problem. And we'll negotiate and talk about that stuff. But generally, I try to defer to them, that they know best what the product needs to do to be successful in the market. And then our job is to bring that to life.
Absolutely. we'll double click on some of that. But I love how we frame the problem. I think it's really important because people tend to leave in a solution mindset, right? If I communicate with my designer, say, hey, we need this filter and it works this way, that's a solution. That's not the problem, right? The problem is, hey, how do you identify certain people very fast? Filter could be one way. There could be other visual highlight, like you said, 15 different ways to solve the problem. And I think your point around path to yes really resonated with our LinkedIn member, Maddie, who wish she knew the path at her current organization. So thank you for sharing that, Bob. Okay, let's transition. We started a little bit talking about design craftsmanship, right? Working with product. Let's double click on some of that. First, how do you differentiate and distinguish, let's say, a great design from a good one? Like design, we usually feel like it's this touchy-feely thing. It's really hard to like verbalize what exactly it is. But when you see great design, like Apple, you know, the packaging, everyone said it's great, but you're not able to really say exactly what's happening. It's like this magical being. So you are really good in matching system thinking, pattern recognition. What would you say are some of the traits that distinguish a great design from a good one?
Well, let me start with how do you develop the ability to distinguish between those two? And it starts with the concept of taste, which most people think is a subjective quality, but it's really not. We accept the concept of taste with food critics and movie critics and art critics and architecture critics. We accept the concept of taste across all other different types of media. So there's no reason we shouldn't accept it with software, which is also a form of media. Now, the question is, how do you get taste? And you don't get taste just because you decide you have taste. Like taste is something you acquire over a long period of time because you've spent an inordinate amount of time looking at similar products in a given space. And you've like really deconstructed them and thought about them a lot. Like movie critics have seen an unbelievable, almost insane number of movies. That's why they have better taste. And so when I talk to particularly to younger designers, I try to tell them you need to think of yourself like you're a young jazz musician. And if you were a young jazz musician, you would have a collection of albums that you listened to all the time. And you knew every little nuance and detail. And you could tell me who did them. And you would have all these little riffs you would pull out. Now, as a designer, I can ask you, what's your favorite app? And you're going to just completely stall out. I bet you 90% of the people on the stream, if I asked them their favorite app, they'd hunt around and then they would decide it was something that they used all the time. Not so they liked it because it had functionality. They can't think about what I like because it's a beautiful expression of some problem, right? It solves some interesting problem in an interesting way. So I always challenge people to think about software in a really broad way, to go through their day collecting inputs from everything. I mean, there's software everywhere. There's, point of sale systems, there's parking meters, there's ATMs, there's all the mess that's on your TV. There's all the garbage you have to get through digitally to get through an airport and get checked on a flight. There's all this stuff happening both with people are seeing on LinkedIn right now, what should be what you and I are seeing here on StreamYard. I mean, there's software everywhere and most of it's a mess. And are you really thinking about it and deconstructing it and wondering why it's a mess and why they did things a certain way? And if you do that for a couple of decades, you'll get really good taste, which is what all the executives at Apple had. I mean, I see a few of my friends there in the stream from Apple. And the secret sauce from Apple that very few people understand is that the level of taste at the executive ranks is unbelievable. Like you wanted to go show work to Jennifer Bailey or Eddie Q or Phil Schiller or Tim Cook or certainly Steve Jobs because they had phenomenal taste. And as soon as you showed it to them, they would identify some way to make it better. So I would just encourage people to think hard about taste and to really start deconstructing products. Like, do I really like Instagram? Do I really like whatever Twitter? Like those products are actually quite a mess. With all due respect to Google, their stuff's kind of a mess. It's ugly. It's interactively inconsistent. It's not magical. And I think you have to deconstruct and ask why.
I like that destructing and then they constructing and the beautiful expression of like how you would solve mess. Before I ask the follow-up question, I just wanted to highlight a couple pointers from people that resonated with what you said previously about if you're fighting over with your designer on solution, then you're probably not aligned on the problem. I definitely resonated to that challenge, sometimes. And definitely focus on the customer problem first, aligning on the why before you dive into the solution. I do wanted to ask a follow-up question on the the what we just talked about, how to build up their tastes and deconstructing an app and like looking for area messes to like clean up. You mentioned about over a decade or decades you can build up that taste. Do you have some tangible tips for people who don't have to wait for a decade? Obviously your level will improve, but what are some like practical, I guess, day-to-day things, a way of thinking that helps you build up this taste?
Well, part of it again is just awareness. Are you really noticing? Are you taking notes? If you ride in an Uber that happens to be a Tesla, are you looking at the dashboard and thinking about, well, how did they arrange it? Why is the information architecture that way? If you're flying, why are the screens navigated that way? When I, because I used to work designing systems for Apple retail employees, I have a high awareness of the employee experience. So much to my family's frustration, when I'm out at a restaurant, I always ask the staff to show me the device that they're using. And I ask them, like, do they like it? Do they like Toast? Do they like Clover? How does it work? I'm just intensely curious about software. So that's a good place to start. You just have to be intensely curious about software. And then this isn't a plug for my book because my book's ancient, but I did write a book and I deconstructed UI into 9 different layers. And if you can start, and that's not an uncommon methodology. People often talk about the structure of a design versus the behavior versus the presentation. And it's similar to how you would break a movie into a pre-production versus production versus post-production. It's kind of a similar creative hierarchy of decisions. So I actually try to spend some time breaking down particular products by each of those levels. So a good example I use is a product called Habitica, which is a to-do list manager and a habit tracker. And what's interesting about Habitica is they didn't gamify habit tracking. They created a game where habit tracking is how you advance your character. And when you play with Habitica, I look at it, I'm like, oh my God, this is genius at the conceptual model level, because they took the conceptual model of a role-playing game and evolving your character through mage and warrior in these different levels. They started with that premise, and then they applied the to-do list habit thing on top of it. So for me, it's like just a really amazing solution to the problem of how do you bring in people and keep them motivated for task managers. So I try, for each one of these different 9 layers, I have products in mind. I'm like, oh, if we were going to look at viewing and navigation behaviors, here's the product I would go to. Here's a product that's really good on copy. Like Slack, for example. I mean, come on, Slack's kind of a mess, but when you really get into it, one of the really outstanding things about Slack is their copy. They have amazing tone and voice in their product. So that's like kind of one thing where a musician, they might listen to a song, they go, oh, the sax part in the bridge is really cool. And they would pay attention to that. And I'm sort of doing the same thing with software.
I love that. I think it's just knowing the different layers and language you can talk to people, and what are the best examples for some of those, the copy, the navigation, the discovery. So it's good to have that repository of inspiration to draw from.
Yeah, I try to point this out, like in movie making, even though none of us, presumably most of us are not professional movie makers on this call, but we all have a vocabulary for how we would break down a movie. If you went to a movie, you could tell me, well, the acting wasn't great, but the special effects were cool. Oh, the score was amazing. Oh, the set decoration was phenomenal. You'd have this language of being able to break all these different parts. But when I show you a piece of software, you just take the whole thing like it's one complete thing. And if I ask you to break it apart, like most people can't quite do that. And it's just where we are in the evolution of the medium. We just don't have much user sophistication yet. But all of you, many of you presumably are in the tech industry. You could start to develop that own vocabulary for yourself. Again, just starting with the basic premise of the information architecture. Does the thing hang together conceptually? And then does it behave in a rational manner? Is it consistent? And then what does it look like? And those are the same models you would use for analyzing a video game as well. So that's a simple.
I love that.
Yeah.
Right. So we touched upon a little bit earlier in our talk about how PMs and designers can work together. We do have 2 questions from the audience. I think we can generalize a little bit. Let's say you are PMs trying to partner with designer, but you need to figure out, visibility with engineering, maybe business metrics that you need to meet. So how do we cultivate like a healthy balance between giving enough creative space for designers, but then also hey, maybe I'm working for a startup. I'm under a lot of pressure, especially in today's macro environment, to move fast, make some quick decision. Maybe the design craftsmanship is going to, suffer a little bit. Like, how do you find that balance? And then I would also like to hear from you, like the question from Tammy about specific, I guess, behaviors. One thing is relying on problem. Like, what else do you think we could do to better work with designers and get the best out of this trio of like product, engineering, and design?
Yeah. So one thing I really try to counsel people is that you need some space in the process where you can just explore broadly. And ideally, the engineers need to be part of this process as well. I really think of design is engineering phase zero. And when Steve Jobs was at Apple, design actually reported into engineering. So I think of design and engineering kind of as tightly coupled, and then obviously product in there as well. And you need those three groups together, and you need to be able to relax your constrained thinking a little bit. And when you and I, in my a lot of my interactions, the PMs are kind of quick to, oh, that won't work, and that's not going to hit our deadline, and the engineers will say this, that, and everything. And like you need to kind of give space to feel out the solution of where you want to get. And once you can define that, then you can kind of back into, okay, what are the constraints we have to deal with right now? Because the constraints are part of the design problem as well, and so they have to be accounted for by the designer. You can't just ignore deadlines and business requirements, etc. That's art. That's not design, right? So what an
Right.
end user might experience as not a great design may have actually been a fantastic design given all the constraints. So that's sort of the number one thing. But I see it in a lot of different companies. It's very hard to get people in the room and just get them to relax and not instantly jump to a solution. And I think they have trouble sitting with the tension of the unknown and the uncertainty of maybe this could work. So if I could say anything, I would, something we've started doing at ThoughtSpot recently is at the beginning of a project, we have the PMs write what we call an opportunity statement, which is only about a one-page document, which sort of describes the thing we want to do. It's small enough that they're not overly committed to it, because as soon as the PM goes and writes a 20-page PRD, they're super attached. And so we want to keep them a little bit disconnected from the idea. We want to just bring the idea in. And then we do a one-day workshop. It's 2 90-minute sessions where we just sort of play with ideas. And we try to wait as long as possible before we draw anything on the whiteboard. And we try to live with the creative tension and the uncertainty of what it's going to be as long as we can. Because as soon as you make a mark, this is what in art, there's this concept of a primal mark. And as soon as the artist puts a mark on the canvas, that mark then defines what everything that's going to happen after that. And so if you rush to a solution, as soon as you get in your head, the thing should be like this, you've kind of already committed. And the designer's now going to have to figure out how to unwind you from that idea. So try to postpone as long as possible, actually giving form to that first idea. And be open to all sorts of different possibilities. And, there's a lot of research that if you're trying to find a solution that is both practical and novel, you have to start with novel. If you start with practical, you'll never back your way into novel. But if you start with novel, you can achieve practicality. So you have to find some way to put aside all the editing and analytical mechanics and just play with ideas. And I'm not talking about forever. I'm talking like 90 minutes. You just got to have some freedom of thought in there. And then you can bring in all the constraints that we have to have it yesterday and blah, blah, blah. But you've got to start with, you got to start with your imagination and then edit back from there.
There's so much nuggets right there. And this is actually near and dear to my heart as I'm going through this 90-minute session that we're trying to write opportunity statement. I love what you were saying about sitting with the tension of unknown, right? Like, just let yourself play with ideas a little bit before you like fixated and driving the focus on execution. I also like what you were saying earlier about constraints are part of the design problem. Earlier in the streaming, someone was asking, what's the difference between an artist and a designer? Well, a designer taking into account like constraints, and that's being part of the problem, the design, versus artists are probably more towards like constraint-free expression at a more abstract level. We're coming up on time. So I wanted to transition into the last part of our conversation, which is around trends and evolutions. And it's getting more and more pointed because of the explosion of generative AI, I think, over the holidays period and in this past 2 months. But you have observed, obviously, a lot of the design discipline evolved from the early Mac days all the way till now. What would you say gets you most excited about what's coming next? And let's start from there.
Yeah. So look, I don't think AI is going to replace taste. So I'm not too worried about that. I think AI is going to be incredibly useful in a couple of different areas for design in particular. One is in fetching and generating a lot of different ideas to expand our exploration. We're in sort of in that maybe phase. So AI will probably be able to go off and come up with solutions that you wouldn't immediately come out of your own imagination, that then your taste level can get involved with and evaluate whether it's good. And we've seen that with AlphaGo in some of the in some of the Go moves that it made. And then when they took the generalized engine and applied it to chess as well. So both in Go and chess, which are long studied problems, AI came up with solutions that no human had ever considered before. So that were novel and very useful solutions. So I suspect that's going to happen with generative AI as well. Then I think generative AI is going to be really useful when the designer has a sketch or some idea of what they want to do, and there's all these little permutations that often have to be made. So we have a dialog box and we want to try, if the font was bigger, this thing moved here, that thing disables. There's all these little variations. Right now that's usually a junior designer or production designer that has to go produce all those variants, and you just have to produce them so you can look at them and then you can evaluate. And that's something that an AI engine could clearly do. So I think that's going to be a huge piece. And then there's already tools where you can give an AI engine a hand-drawn sketch, and it can apply a certain visual style to it. So I think it's going to be, my sense is that in the near term, you're going to see AI helping with the inputs to ideation, and it's going to help a lot with the production. And you've kind of already seen this in animation. Like when you went to digital animation, you had this concept of tweening, where the animator only had to draw the beginning frame and the ending frame, and then the computer would draw everything in between. In hand-drawn animation, you got to draw all those frames. Every little animal in Snow White, they had to draw 24 frames a second, which is what's cool about Snow White, because everything breathes and they all breathe on their own cadence. There's a lot of drawing, and computers obviously don't require that level of human effort. So I think that's going to be a huge shift as well.
That's awesome. Just calling out a couple comments from the community. Opportunity statement is very practical, very helpful. And then really love the mindset that you mentioned about, a level of freedom of thoughts, thinking about novelty first before you consider the practical. And I think some folks might have problems listening to the stream, so make sure you refresh the page. Apologize for the inconvenience. I think we have a little bit more problem on mobile apps sometimes than on desktop. So Bob, I do want to double click on some of the AI stuff, because it's great to hear that you don't think that AI assisted design will replace taste. But as someone who's like, a junior designer, for example, or product builders, yes, AI can help us like explore different ideas, but it got nerve wracking from a skill building perspective and career job security standpoint, right? What would you say some of the things that they can do to like upskill themselves to continue to stay relevant and competitive and employable? What are some things that they can do to level up?
Yeah, look, I'm not sure I got a great answer here, because this is a brave new world for all of us. Again, I kind of go back to taste and judgment, and you see it on the writing side right now. You can have AI engines that generate all sorts of copy, but if you take a professional writer, even a slightly critical reader, and you go look at that stuff, you're like, I don't know, man, this is not very good. So I think as a junior designer, again, it comes back to, can you develop your sense of taste so that you can have some judgment about what the engines are producing, and then give them better inputs for how to improve what they're producing. So I think maybe I'm just speculating here, but maybe what you need to be thinking about is, how do I skip that long that long apprenticeship as a designer and go straight to a creative director? What if I don't have to be a player so much as I have to be a coach? What does that mean? What are those skills? And a lot of time, we're here in San Francisco, so I think about the Golden State Warriors a lot. I mean, obviously Steve Kerr had a great playing career, but Steve Kerr's a fantastic coach, and I'm sure his playing career helped him become a coach. But he's a good coach great coach in and of himself. So how do you, at any level of your career, how do you become a great coach? Because it may be that the AI engines are going to become your players rather than other human beings. And by the way, being a great coach is a terrific skill, anyways. Whether you're working with humans or machines or animals, it's a great skill to be able to harness the intellectual energy of all sorts of different brains, organic, chemical, or artificial. So
I love that player versus coach mentality. Make AI your player. So that's the key takeaway for me.
Yeah, I think we're all
All
hoping
right.
that the AI is not going to be the coach, but we'll see.
That's the hope, right? Fingers crossed. All right. I think we're coming up in time, and it's been a really, really great session, Bob. The community loves it. Leslie have summarized, what her main takeaways from, focusing on the problem, not the solution, the importance of taste, use of opportunity statement, learning a lot from the session. Now, Bob, we usually close every session with a round of lightning question from our
Oh,
guests.
this is
Are
my
you ready for
favorite.
the
I'm
challenge?
ready. Yeah, here we
Yeah.
go.
Okay. So the first question is what you mentioned before that you asked junior designers. What's your favorite product and why? Let's hear it from you.
Um,
What's your
yeah, so
favorite
I
product?
actually do like Habitica a lot, just because of I don't use it all the time, but I just think it's a very novel solution to an interesting problem. So I really like that. I actually really like my Leica cameras, which are super expensive, but if you look at the most recent Leica cameras, they've gotten the software really honed down to just the essentials. I also like my 2013 Mini with the analog speedometer in the middle, because there's something tactile and I don't know. There's something that like the entire interior of that Mini makes sense as a small sports car with the manual transmission and low to the ground. It just, the whole thing makes sense aesthetically in a way that I think the current ones really don't, because they're too electronic and too artificial. Um, I got some Lego models that I'm really impressed with. I could go on. I have to admit,
That's
there's not a
awesome.
ton of software that I love, because I can see all the flaws in it. So I don't have a
Mm.
lot of great examples on the software side.
That's interesting that you point out a lot more hardware stuff than the digital stuff, but you do have more examples than most of the speakers I speak with. I think people have like
Oh, I was
one or
just
two,
getting
but you have
started.
like you have like a backlog of product that you can talk about. That's awesome. Okay, second question: who would you consider as the most influential product role model or leader in your career?
Yeah, well, this isn't obvious. So Steve Jobs, obviously. I mean, Steve was just a product genius. If we have just a second, I'll tell a quick story that I think summarizes Steve really well. When they were starting to work on Keynote, Roger Rosner, who was the VP of engineering for the iWork team, asked Steve, how should we think about Keynote? And Steve came back and he said three things. One, you should focus on cinematic quality transitions. Two, it should be difficult to make ugly presentations. And three, you should optimize for innovation over PowerPoint compatibility. And I think about all three of those. We call those tenants. And most of, I now had that whole methodology of like, what are the tenants? And if you think about any one of those statements, we can take the last one in particular, optimize for innovation over PowerPoint compatibility. Can you imagine how many downstream debates got taken off the table because he made that clear statement? It's like paper versus plastic. You can't try to make that decision every time you're at the grocery store. You got to decide and go with it. And so I just think he was genius at kind of establishing that product vision and those tenants and giving that clarity of thought to the teams before they started. So he was very good at making sure that the teams ran a process of ready, then aim, and then fire. In most organizations, it's kind of fire and then ready and then aim. It's kind of which is why it gets awfully messy and frustrating.
I love that example. Thanks for sharing. Those tenants are very clear. So it's very
Yeah,
powerful.
yeah, super clear.
Um,
So
All right. What would be your final piece of advice or some books, some resources? You mentioned about your book, but what else? Or maybe your book should be your final piece of advice that you like to give
yeah.
to current and
Well, I wouldn't
aspiring
necessarily put my book in there.
product
Like
workers.
a lot of people want to learn about Apple and companies like that. So Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull, which is a history of Pixar and tells you a lot about how Pixar works. And then the thing about Pixar is, at least for a long time, Pixar basically worked like Apple. They're basically the same company. So Creativity Inc., even though it's a book about Pixar, is one of the best books written about Apple, because the two companies focus or function the same way, or at least they did. I haven't been at Apple in a long time, but so Creativity Inc. by Ed Catmull. There's another book called Creative Selection by Ken Kashenda. Ken was one of the iOS engineers. He's the guy that invented the keyboard for iOS. He's the one that came up with how to type on glass. In his book, Creative Selection, he talks about what it was like working at Apple under Steve. And that's far and away the most accurate representation that I've seen of what I experienced at Apple. So if you want to know how Apple works, that's another great one. Those are good places to start. I mean, there's plenty of other things. People can ping me on LinkedIn or whatever. I have a whole resource page I can send you with all sorts of different books. One of the things I
Yes,
often
that
point
would be
people
great.
to, because a lot of PMs always ask me about storytelling and selling vision. The two examples I use there is definitely go watch Steve Jobs' announcement of the iPhone in 2006, I guess it is, the Macworld announcement, and then deconstruct how he does that. And then the speech of all speeches is to go watch President Kennedy's speech in 1962 at Rice University when he announces the Apollo program. It's about 17 minutes. It's like the ultimate TED talk, and get the transcript and then deconstruct it to how he breaks down the arguments and how by the end of that thing, you're convinced we're going to the moon. Like how did he sell that vision? Because he goes through the timeline, the budget, the technical challenges, the engineering challenges, everything. It's phenomenal. I actually have a talk. If you look for me, I have a talk called Kennedy, Crayons, and Craft, where I break down his speech and talk through it by kind of paragraph by paragraph. So for PMs,
That's
like how
awesome.
to sell a vision, those are far and away the two best resources for that.
Yeah, I love the Creativity Inc. One of my favorite book. And then Putting a Man in the Moon is also, like you said, one of the best speech that's worth, and obvious Steve Jobs announcement of iPhone. Those are great resources. So for folks who are joining and listening, make sure you subscribe to our newsletter because I'll drop some of these links for your easy reference. But thank you so much, Bob. This has been such a value-added session. Everybody is loving it. They're learning a lot from you. So thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah. Thank you. Thanks for the opportunity.
On behalf of the LinkedIn community, we appreciate your and happy Friday. Thank you everyone for joining, and see you next Friday.
Thanks for joining, everybody. Thanks for the opportunity. Have a great weekend.